On a quiet spring afternoon, the playground was filled with the kind of noise that made parents feel safe. Children shouting, sneakers slapping the pavement, laughter echoing between the metal slides and monkey bars. The sun filtered down through trees that had just begun to bloom, their shadows falling across the sand pit and the row of swings. It was the kind of day where nothing felt out of place. Mothers sat on benches, some speaking in hushed tones, others scrolling through their phones while children ran in circles, their voices carrying across the open air. Among them was a little girl, only 6 years old, whose smile seemed to pull every ounce of life from that afternoon into one place. She was on the swing, her legs pumping high, her hair catching the light as she rose and fell with each motion. Her mother sat just a few yards away, on a worn wooden bench. She watched her daughter with the comfortable ease of a parent who had seen the same routine play out countless times. The swing moved back and forth, creaking softly at its chain joints. The mother glanced down briefly at a bag beside her feet, pulling out a water bottle and unscrewing the cap. It couldn't have been more than a few seconds. But when she lifted her eyes again, the swing was empty. It swayed gently, the chains clinking, the seat moving with a rhythm that suggested someone had only just jumped off. Her daughter was gone. At first, she thought it was a game, the kind of thing children did, darting behind the climbing frame or crouching under the slide, waiting to be found. She stood quickly, her heart not yet racing, but her voice sharp with urgency as she called out her daughter's name. Other children glanced toward her, distracted from their play, but none answered. She moved toward the swing set, scanning the ground as if expecting to see her daughter crouched and giggling in the sand. Nothing. The silence that met her calls began to stretch too long, and what had been a moment of mild confusion hardened into panic. Parents nearby took notice. One asked what had happened, and another looked toward the park's exit, a narrow gap in the fence that opened onto a street lined with cars. The mother ran toward it, shouting again, her voice cracking as it grew louder. She darted her head side to side, searching the sidewalk, the street, the small patch of grass just beyond. No trace. The girl hadn't wandered off toward the bathrooms, she wasn't near the picnic tables, and she wasn't in the sand pit where other children were digging with plastic shovels. Within minutes, the entire playground shifted from a place of laughter to a place of fear. Strangers stood from benches, looking under slides, calling her name. A father jogged toward the parking lot, scanning between the rows of vehicles. Another woman ran toward the baseball field nearby. Children, sensing the alarm, were pulled back by their parents, told to stay close. The swing still moved faintly, its chains rattling in the breeze, the only sign that she had been there at all. The mother's panic rose to a breaking point. She dialed 911 with shaking hands, her words tumbling over one another, telling the dispatcher that her daughter had vanished. One moment she was swinging, the next she was gone. The call went out, and sirens soon followed, cutting through the air as patrol cars converged on the neighborhood. Officers poured into the playground, immediately setting up a perimeter and telling parents to remain in place. What had been a sunny afternoon of ordinary routines had now collapsed into chaos. Police began their sweep, moving methodically through every corner of the park. Officers searched behind bathrooms, checked the wooded edges, and looked into every open car window in the lot. Parents and children were asked to stay back, though many couldn't resist peering anxiously toward the officers combing the grounds. The mother's voice carried over everything, breaking again and again as she repeated her daughter's name, hoping for an answer that never came. It didn't take long before authorities realized how serious the situation was. This wasn't a case of a child wandering off a little too far. The time frame was too short, the distance too small. She had been there, visible, and then she wasn't. Witnesses were gathered and questioned. Some recalling seeing her moments before, others admitting they hadn't noticed. A few thought they remembered a man near the edge of the park, but the details shifted with every retelling. Dark jacket, maybe blue, walking fast, maybe lingering. Nothing conclusive, just fragments. The longer the search went on, the more reality sank in. Parents began pulling their children away, holding their hands tightly as they crossed the grass to their cars, fearful now that the playground was no longer safe. Officers extended the search perimeter, moving into nearby streets, knocking on doors and scanning yards. The sound of the swing chains faded as the breeze died, leaving the playground unnervingly still. By nightfall, floodlights were brought in, casting long shadows across the sand and pavement. Detectives arrived, speaking in clipped tones, already preparing for the worst, while still hoping for the best. They interviewed the mother repeatedly, trying to piece together the timeline down to the minute. She told them the same thing over and over. Her daughter had been laughing on the swing, she had looked down for a second, and then she was gone. That was all. That was everything. As darkness settled, the search expanded beyond the park, into nearby wooded trails and drainage ditches. Volunteers joined in, walking with flashlights, calling her name into the night. The fear had spread beyond one family, now gripping an entire community. And in the middle of it all sat the empty swing, motionless now, its silence heavier than any words spoken that night. It was as if the metal chains themselves held the last trace of the girl. The searchers kept moving, but the thought lingered. How could a child vanish so completely in plain sight, in broad daylight, surrounded by people? It was the question that would drive everything that came after, the mystery that would refuse to let go. The first patrol cars pulled up within minutes, their sirens cutting off abruptly as officers stepped out onto the grass. The mother stood frozen near the swings, her face streaked with tears, her voice nearly gone from shouting her daughter's name. The playground, once filled with laughter, now felt like a stage set in the middle of a nightmare. Officers moved fast, establishing a perimeter around the park, tape stretching between trees and fences, sealing the space where just an hour earlier children had played freely. Parents gathered their kids, pulling them close, whispering reassurances that didn't sound convincing, their eyes darting toward every stranger still lingering nearby. Detectives and uniformed officers split up quickly, some moving through the lot to check vehicles, others canvassing the playground, interviewing anyone who had been there that afternoon. They needed to lock down the last sightings of the girl. Mothers pointed toward the swing, explaining how they had seen her moments before. A teenager on a bike said he noticed her laughing as she pumped her legs higher. Another parent mentioned a man standing near the fence line, but when pressed, admitted they couldn't recall what he looked like. The fragments didn't fit together, and the absence of clear detail made the situation even more terrifying. The mother was surrounded by officers but seemed unreachable, her words tumbling in pieces, insisting she had looked away only briefly, that she never saw her daughter leave the swing. They guided her to a patrol car to sit down, offering water she couldn't bring herself to drink. Her eyes kept returning to the empty swing, swaying lightly in the wind, as though waiting for her daughter to return to it. Officers exchanged glances, understanding what every parent in that park was now feeling. If a child could vanish in broad daylight, surrounded by witnesses, then no place was truly safe. Word of the disappearance spread quickly through the neighborhood. People emerged from houses bordering the park, some carrying jackets over their pajamas, others clutching phones, dialing friends and family. Neighbors who had lived there for decades, who thought they knew every face and every routine, found themselves scanning the crowd with suspicion. The familiar suddenly felt dangerous. Strangers who had been invisible, dog walkers, cyclists, workers cutting across the grass, were now potential suspects in everyone's eyes. The quiet trust of the town fractured in a matter of hours. By dusk, the playground looked less like a park and more like a command post. Floodlights illuminated the sandpit, casting harsh shadows across the slides and jungle gym. Officers moved methodically, marking potential evidence, though there was little to see. No discarded clothing, no shoe prints that stood out from the dozens already stamped into the sand, no trail leading away. The swings moved faintly, as if mocking the search, offering no answers. Teams with flashlights fanned out through the surrounding streets, knocking on doors, asking residents if they had seen a child walking alone or being pulled into a car. Most hadn't seen anything unusual, but a handful mentioned a vehicle idling near the curb earlier, a dark sedan, though none could recall the license plate. Parents held their children tighter as the hours dragged on. Some refused to leave the playground, their own kids huddled against them, too afraid to let them out of reach. Others hurried home, locking doors and double-checking windows, a ritual that would soon become routine in a neighborhood that had never before considered itself unsafe. The silence that grew in that space wasn't just the absence of a missing girl. It was the sudden collapse of a community's sense of security. Local reporters arrived, their cameras set up just beyond the police tape. They spoke in low tones, repeating the same lines. A child had vanished from a playground in broad daylight, a disappearance witnessed only by absence. Families watched from behind curtains, televisions flickering with updates, each broadcast amplifying the fear. Parents who had allowed their children to roam freely began setting strict rules, forbidding unsupervised play, warning them not to talk to anyone they didn't know. The town that once prided itself on being safe now felt like it had been exposed as fragile and vulnerable. As midnight neared, detectives gathered to reassess. They had canvassed every house within a 2-block radius, spoken to dozens of witnesses, and yet had nothing concrete. No one had seen her leave. No one could point to a single moment where she was taken. It was as if she had dissolved into thin air. For officers trained to rely on timelines and witness accounts, the lack of a clear sequence was unnerving. It wasn't just a missing child case, it was a riddle, and the answer was nowhere to be found. The mother remained at the park, refusing to leave even as the temperature dropped. Officers tried to convince her to go home and rest, but she stayed, her eyes locked on the swings. Some parents who lingered whispered among themselves, their voices tight with fear. If the child could vanish here, with everyone watching, it could happen anywhere, to any of theirs. The night ended with more questions than answers, but the shock had already spread far beyond the yellow tape. The disappearance wasn't just a tragedy for one family anymore. It was a fracture that ran through the entire community. Trust had been broken, suspicion planted, and fear made permanent. As search teams prepared to expand their efforts at first light, the town braced itself for what was coming. What began as a normal afternoon on a playground was no longer a local scare. It had become the kind of story that would follow every household, shaping the way they lived and reminding them of what could vanish in an instant. In the days after the girl's disappearance, the case spread quickly from local headlines to nightly broadcasts. Reporters repeated the same haunting detail. A 6-year-old child vanished from a playground swing in broad daylight, surrounded by families with no one able to explain how. News anchors leaned into words like mystery and baffling, while newspapers printed grainy photos of the girl, her school portrait showing her in a bright shirt with a shy half-smile. Flyers went up on every lamppost and store window, her face becoming impossible to ignore. At first, the coverage carried a tone of urgency, but soon it turned speculative, and with speculation came division. Theories started in whispers, spreading from the park to grocery aisles and church pews. Some believed the child had been targeted by a stranger, someone who waited for the right moment to strike. Parents began trading descriptions of cars seen parked near the playground in recent weeks: dark sedans, white vans, anything that seemed unfamiliar. Every stranger in town became a subject of scrutiny, but just as quickly, suspicion turned inward. Others began to question whether the abduction could have been orchestrated by someone close to the family. Old disputes, half-remembered arguments, and neighborhood gossip resurfaced, giving people a framework for blame. Detectives were forced to navigate the swell of rumors that threatened to bury legitimate leads. They received calls from neighbors claiming to have seen suspicious men lingering by fences, from store clerks who swore a customer had matched the girl's description just hours before, from anonymous voices who suggested the mother herself was hiding something. None of it came with solid evidence. Each tip had to be checked, every claim investigated, stretching the department thin. The more the story spread, the more tangled the lines between truth and speculation became. Into that chaos came voices offering guidance that was anything but scientific. Psychics called the station, insisting they could sense where the girl was being held, describing basements and wooded trails that led nowhere. Some claimed she was still alive, others said she had been taken far beyond state lines. Families desperate for answers listened to them, grasping at hope even as detectives dismissed those leads as distractions. For investigators trained to focus on evidence, the psychic involvement frustrated progress. Yet they couldn't ignore the way families clung to it when the facts remained so painfully scarce. Meanwhile, the family lived under a microscope. The mother's grief was broadcast on nightly news, her interviews picked apart by strangers analyzing every expression, every pause in her words. When she cried, some claimed she was performing. When she appeared calm, others said she seemed cold. In the absence of answers, the public turned its scrutiny on her, questioning her parenting, her relationships, even her role in the disappearance. For a woman already shattered, it was another kind of torment, one she could neither escape nor fight. Inside the department, detectives debated what theory made the most sense. Stranger abductions were rare, but not impossible. Family-involved disappearances were statistically more likely, yet nothing in the mother's history indicated violence or neglect. The father, who lived separately, was thoroughly investigated and cleared. Friends and relatives were questioned, their homes searched, their vehicles tested for traces of the child. Nothing pointed to a clear suspect. Theories multiplied, but evidence stood still. The town, once defined by neighborly trust, began to splinter. Parents eyed one another differently at school pickups, wondering who among them could be capable of such a crime. Playdates were canceled, children pulled from after-school programs, playgrounds that once rang with laughter now sat empty. The community that had banded together in the first frantic days was now divided, each household holding its own beliefs about what had happened. Some continued to organize vigils and searches, clinging to hope that the girl was still alive. Others quietly believed the worst, and with that came anger, the belief that someone among them was responsible. Local businesses saw their walls covered with posters of the missing girl, her face fading as the weeks turned into months. But with each new headline, each fresh rumor, the original urgency of the case began to shift into something darker, an obsession. Neighbors dissected timelines, plotted maps, and speculated in online forums. Amateur sleuths flooded the police tip line, convinced they had cracked the mystery based on gut feelings or coincidences. Detectives had to separate genuine information from noise, a task that consumed precious time. The noise didn't just distract investigators, it poisoned relationships. Families who once borrowed sugar from one another now locked doors in broad daylight. People whispered about who had been questioned, who had refused polygraph tests, who had failed to show up at community searches. The fear that anyone could be guilty created an undercurrent of paranoia that lingered long after the nightly news moved on to other stories. The absence of answers allowed the rumors to grow stronger than the facts themselves, and in that vacuum, the case stalled. Detectives were left chasing shadows while the town tore itself apart under the weight of speculation. The little girl was no closer to being found, alive or dead. All that remained was a swing that no longer moved, and a community that could no longer look at itself without suspicion. The investigation would eventually shift again, pulled forward by evidence buried for years. But in those first months, the case belonged less to law enforcement and more to the rumors that consumed the town, rumors that would leave scars long before the truth was ever unearthed. As weeks turned into months, the search for the missing girl shifted from urgency to endurance. The flyers that once covered telephone poles and storefront windows began to curl at the edges, weathered by sun and rain until the colors faded and the paper tore. News crews stopped camping outside the playground. The story that had once consumed headlines was replaced by other tragedies, other names. But for her mother, time did not move forward. It stalled at the exact moment the swing stopped swaying. Every day that passed without answers felt like living the same nightmare on repeat, a silence that only grew heavier with each passing season. Detectives continued to work the case, but as the trail grew colder, their visits to the family's home became less frequent. Leads dried up. Tips that once poured in daily slowed to a trickle, and most were dead ends. Strangers certain they had seen a girl who looked like her in another town, another state, another life. Each sighting brought a brief surge of hope, followed by the crushing realization that it wasn't her. The mother clung to these fragments anyway, unable to let go, replaying the possibility that somewhere, somehow, her daughter might still be alive. The playground where it happened was eventually repainted. The city invested in new equipment, bright colors meant to restore the park to a place of joy for families. But the swing set remained, its chains replaced, its frame polished, and yet it stood as a reminder no fresh coat of paint could erase. Parents avoided it, guiding their children toward the slides or the jungle gym, as if the swing itself carried the memory of what had happened. For those who lived nearby, It became impossible to pass without glancing toward it. The image of that empty seat forever burned into their minds. For the mother, the playground was both unbearable and necessary. She returned often, sitting on the same wooden bench where she had been that day, staring at the swings, hoping for something she couldn't name. Sometimes she spoke softly into the air, as if her daughter could hear her. Other times, she sat in silence, watching strangers' children play, the sound of their laughter both comforting and excruciating. Neighbors began to avoid the subject when she was near, offering polite nods instead of words. They didn't know what to say anymore. Detectives, in private, admitted the case had gone cold. Stranger abductions that yielded no evidence in the first days rarely ended with recovery. They filed updates, revisited evidence, and ran checks when new technology became available. But without witnesses, without physical traces, they were left circling the same unanswered questions. Some believed the girl had been taken by someone passing through town, never to return. Others held on to the theory that someone local had hidden her away. None of the theories mattered without proof, and there was none to be found. The community's response shifted over time. In the first year, vigils were held, candles lit along the park fence, prayers spoken in the cool night air. By the second year, attendance thinned. By the fifth, only the mother remained faithful to the anniversaries, standing at the swing set with flowers in hand while the rest of the town turned its attention to other concerns. The silence of the community became another kind of grief, as though people had decided to bury the memory of the girl even without finding her. Children who had once been her classmates grew older, moving on to new grades, new schools. Their parents spoke quietly about how their own kids still remembered her, how some of them refused to use the swings anymore. Teachers who had once written her name on rosters now left the space blank, but they remembered the way she had laughed, the way she had struggled with her handwriting, the way she had been full of life. These details, small and ordinary, became the only pieces of her left in the open, fragments of a life interrupted. The mother never moved away. Friends and relatives urged her to start over somewhere else, but she refused. Leaving meant giving up, and giving up meant admitting her daughter would never come back. The house remained as it had been on the day of the disappearance, the child's bedroom preserved with toys still on shelves and clothes folded in drawers. It was a shrine to a life paused mid-sentence. For her, time had stopped, and until she had answers, it would never start again. Years passed this way, the case frozen in limbo. Detectives rotated out of the department, some retiring, others transferred, leaving the file to new investigators who would look at it briefly before moving on to fresher cases. Each time the mother called for updates, she heard the same response. They had nothing new to report. The girl's face aged artificially in computer-generated images, distributed every few years as age progressions, digital guesses of who she might look like now. But the real child, the one who had vanished, remained 6 years old forever. The town learned to live with the absence, though it was never forgotten. People still locked doors earlier at night. Parents still gripped their children's hands tighter at playgrounds. The wound had stitched itself into daily life, invisible but never healed. And yet, buried beneath the surface of the ordinary, the truth waited. It would be years before workers digging in the park would uncover what had been hidden in plain sight, years before the silence would break. For now, the swing stood as a monument to loss, its empty seat holding more weight than anyone in that town could carry. 8 years after the girl vanished, the playground had settled into a strange kind of normal. Children played there again, though fewer than before, and parents still cast cautious glances toward the swing set. The case had become a memory, spoken of in hushed tones when newcomers asked about the past, a story the town carried like an invisible scar. For the mother, it was never the past. She still lived in the same house, still visited the park, still stared at the swing as though waiting for her daughter to appear. Nothing had changed for her, though for the rest of the town life had pressed forward. That uneasy peace shattered on an otherwise ordinary morning. City workers arrived at the park to begin long-overdue renovations. Plans called for resurfacing the playground, replacing old sand pits with rubber padding, and modernizing the area that parents had once described as outdated. The crew brought heavy equipment, trucks, and shovels. They started near the swing set, digging into a sand pit that had sat there since long before the disappearance. What they unearthed would turn the playground into the center of attention once more, but this time in a way no one could have imagined. As the workers dug deeper into the sand, one of the shovels struck something hard. At first they assumed it was debris, maybe a piece of wood or old equipment left from earlier repairs. But when the sand was brushed away, what emerged was not metal or wood. It was plastic, thick, weathered, and tightly wrapped. The crew paused, realizing it didn't belong there. When they pulled back the layers, a smell rose from the ground, unmistakable and heavy. Inside the plastic was a bundle that stopped every man on that site in his tracks. Within it were bones, small and fragile, the unmistakable remains of a child. The work halted immediately. Supervisors called police, who arrived within minutes, sealing off the playground once again with yellow tape that had not been seen there in years. Parents who had brought children to play were rushed away, some carrying them out in tears, realizing what had been found. Word spread like wildfire. Something had been buried beneath the playground all along. The site that had been a place of joy, then grief, and then uneasy silence was now a crime scene. Forensic teams descended on the park, their vans lined up across the curb. Investigators in gloves and masks moved carefully around the sandpit, photographing, documenting, and excavating with precision. They removed the bundle slowly, placing it in evidence bags before transferring it to the coroner's office. The playground equipment, the swings, the slides, all of it was now cordoned off as potential evidence. Officers pushed crowds back as neighbors gathered at the perimeter, whispering in disbelief. After 8 years of questions, part of the answer had surfaced from beneath their feet. The news spread across the county by evening. Television crews once again filled the park, their lights casting harsh shadows across the taped-off area. The story dominated headlines. Bones had been found buried in the very sand where children had played for nearly a decade. Questions erupted immediately. How long had the remains been there? Had the child been killed the day she disappeared, hidden within feet of where the search began? And the most disturbing question of all, how could dozens of officers, investigators, and volunteers have scoured that very park and missed what had been buried just inches below the surface? For detectives who had carried the case for years, the discovery was devastating. It suggested that while they had expanded their search outward, into neighborhoods, fields, highways, and other towns, the answer had been buried close to the original scene. Some officers admitted quietly that the revelation felt like a failure, a reminder of how fragile investigations could be when the smallest detail went unseen. The community shared that anger. Parents who had let their children return to the playground were horrified to learn that their kids had dug sandcastles and played tag within feet of a grave. The mother was notified late that evening. When detectives arrived at her door, the look on their faces told her before their words did. After 8 years of uncertainty, she was given the confirmation she had both dreaded and expected. The bones were believed to be her daughter's. The news did not bring closure. It reopened wounds that had never healed, forcing her to confront the reality that her child had been killed and buried in the place she had spent years returning to in hope. Neighbors recalled her scream echoing through the quiet street that night, a sound that carried grief deeper than words could express. In the following days, the park transformed completely. Once again, it was sealed off with floodlights and guarded by patrol cars. Forensic experts combed through every inch of sand and soil, searching for fibers, hair, or any trace that might point to who had done this. They sifted the earth with fine tools, bagging even the smallest fragments. Officers measured distances, photographed tire tracks left by construction crews, and revisited the original case files to compare notes. What had once been a cold case was now active again, ignited by a discovery that shocked the town to its core. Theories reignited immediately. If the body had been buried there from the beginning, then the killer had returned to the scene of the crime during the chaos of the initial search, taking the risk of hiding her in plain sight. That possibility suggested someone confident, someone who lived close enough to know the investigation's blind spots. It also meant the killer might have walked freely among the community all these years, passing neighbors on sidewalks, attending the same stores, watching as families moved on. For the people who had tried to convince themselves the nightmare was behind them, the discovery proved otherwise. The playground was no longer just a place tied to one tragedy. It was evidence of betrayal, a reminder that the town had been living with a secret hidden beneath its most public space. Parents, who had once reluctantly allowed their children back there, swore they never would again. The swing set stood frozen, cordoned off by tape, its empty seats a chilling marker of what had finally surfaced. 8 years of silence had ended in one unthinkable discovery. But instead of closure, the town was left with a new and disturbing reality. The missing girl had never left. She had been there all along, hidden just below the surface, waiting for someone to find her. And with that revelation came the next inevitable question. If her body had been buried in the park, then who among them had put her there? The sandpit was treated like sacred ground once the discovery was made. Forensic teams moved in with painstaking precision, surrounding the area with tarps to shield it from weather and outside contamination. Every shovel of dirt was sifted, every fragment catalogued. The bundle of plastic that held the bones was removed intact and sealed in evidence containers before being carried away. Specialists worked silently, knowing the eyes of an entire town were fixed on their every move. What they carried from that sandpit wasn't just a set of remains. It was the first real evidence in a case that had haunted investigators for nearly a decade. At the medical examiner's office, the bones were examined by forensic anthropologists who measured, photographed, and documented them in detail. The remains were fragile, but consistent with a child around 6 years old, the same age the girl had been when she vanished. Teeth were carefully removed for DNA extraction, each step documented to preserve the chain of evidence. Detectives who had worked the case from the beginning gathered outside the lab, waiting for results that could finally confirm what everyone already feared. When the DNA match came back, the truth was undeniable. The remains belonged to the missing girl. After 8 years of questions, the mystery of where she was had been answered, but the answer brought no relief. For her mother, the confirmation destroyed the last fragile thread of hope she had carried for nearly a decade. She had told herself her daughter might be living somewhere else under another name, that maybe she had been taken but was still alive. The DNA stripped those illusions away, leaving nothing but grief and rage. News of the confirmation spread quickly, reigniting old wounds across the community. Families who had allowed themselves to believe she might return now had to face the reality that she had been killed the very day she vanished. Vigils were held again, this time marked by sorrow rather than hope. Parents kept their children even closer, wondering how such horror could have happened in broad daylight in their own park. And the same question surfaced everywhere. How could her body have been buried so close to where she disappeared, hidden in a place investigators had searched countless times? For detectives, the discovery created as many problems as it solved. The initial investigation had involved hundreds of officers, search dogs, even ground-penetrating equipment in certain areas. Yet somehow the sandpit had gone unnoticed. Some officers admitted privately they had assumed the pit was too shallow or too public a place for a body to be hidden. Others suggested the remains may not have been buried there immediately, raising the terrifying possibility that the killer had returned to the park later, slipping past neighbors and police to conceal the evidence in plain sight. The medical examiner's findings deepened those suspicions. The condition of the bones suggested they had been in the ground for years, but analysis could not pinpoint exactly when they were buried. Fibers found on the plastic wrapping hinted at storage before burial, raising the possibility that her body had been kept elsewhere before being hidden in the sand. Detectives were forced to reopen every theory, every suspect, every timeline. The idea that the killer might have stood among them during searches, watching as police looked everywhere but the one spot that mattered, unsettled everyone who had been there. The mother's devastation became public once again. Reporters described her breaking down when officials confirmed the remains. She told neighbors she had spent years sitting on that very bench, staring at the swings, never knowing her daughter was only a few feet away beneath the ground. The weight of that truth was unbearable. Friends and relatives tried to comfort her, but there was no comfort in knowing the answers had been there all along. For her, it was as if the playground itself had betrayed her. In town meetings, residents demanded to know how authorities had missed it. Officials explained the challenges of large-scale searches, the way evidence could be overlooked in chaotic early hours, but the explanations did little to ease the anger. People who had trusted the investigation felt betrayed, believing the truth could have been found years earlier, if only someone had dug deeper into the sand. That anger extended to suspicion. If the burial had occurred later, then the killer had lived among them all this time, blending into daily life without anyone realizing. Forensic reports also revealed chilling details. Marks on the plastic suggested it had been tied and sealed deliberately, not hastily. The effort taken to wrap the body indicated planning, not impulse. Whoever was responsible had not acted out of sudden panic. They had taken steps to ensure the remains stayed hidden. To detectives, it suggested someone with experience, or at least someone methodical enough to think ahead even in the aftermath of murder. That detail pointed away from random strangers and back toward the possibility of someone within the community. The discovery shifted the case from tragedy to horror. It was no longer just a child lost, but a child deliberately killed and hidden in a place meant for joy. The swing that had once carried her laughter now stood as a grim monument to what had been buried beside it. Parents who brought their children there in the following days stood at the perimeter tape, unable to comprehend how their safe haven had been the site of such darkness. The town's illusions of safety were shattered. Detectives knew the hardest questions still lay ahead. Who had the access and the boldness to bury a body in the middle of a public park? How had they gone unnoticed during the days and weeks after the disappearance? And most haunting of all, why had they chosen to return the child to the very place she had been taken from? The forensic answers had confirmed her identity, but they had also opened a door to deeper, more disturbing mysteries. Detectives knew the discovery of the girl's remains meant every theory had to be reopened. Files that had gathered dust for nearly a decade were pulled from storage, witness statements reread, timelines redrawn. The list of names that had once been considered and dismissed was brought back into focus. This time, with the knowledge that the child had been buried in the very park where she vanished, the questions carried new weight. Investigators moved methodically, revisiting every suspect and every alibi that had once seemed airtight. One of the first people re-examined was a maintenance worker who had been responsible for the park in those years. He had keys to storage sheds, access at odd hours, and knew the layout of the grounds better than anyone. At the time of the disappearance, he had been questioned and cleared when his alibi placed him on another job across town. But now detectives wanted more. They checked payroll records, time cards, even GPS data from old work vehicles to confirm his movements. They discovered gaps, hours unaccounted for, that had never been noticed in the chaos of the original investigation. When questioned again, he repeated his story. But the inconsistencies lingered. A neighbor who lived across the street from the park was also revisited. She had been one of the first to call police, telling them she saw nothing unusual that afternoon. In the years that followed, she rarely spoke about the case, and neighbors described her as withdrawn, avoiding community events. Detectives pressed her again, asking why she hadn't noticed the burial if it had happened later, in plain view of her windows. Her answers were vague, her memory clouded by time. Some investigators believed she was simply traumatized. Others quietly wondered if her silence was something more. Even children who had been at the park that day, now teenagers, were interviewed again. Detectives hoped the distance of years might loosen memories, that what they had once been too young to articulate might now be clearer. Some recalled seeing adults lingering near the swings, others remembered cars parked along the curb, details that had once seemed unimportant. But none could offer the kind of clarity investigators needed. Their testimonies only highlighted how many eyes had been there, and yet how little had been truly seen. Detectives also returned to the girl's family circle. The mother, broken by grief but cooperative, repeated what she had said countless times before. The father, who had been living separately, once again faced questioning. His alibi from that day, a shift at work, verified by multiple colleagues, remained solid. Extended family members were reviewed too, their homes and histories scrutinized with the knowledge that the killer might have been close enough to understand police blind spots. None revealed the missing piece investigators were desperate to find. As the re-interviews continued, one disturbing theory began to take shape. The forensic evidence suggested the girl's body might not have been buried in the sandpit immediately after she vanished. It was possible she had been kept elsewhere, hidden for days or even weeks, before being returned to the very place she had last been seen. If that was true, it meant the killer had watched the chaos of the investigation unfold, waited until the search scaled down, and then chosen the boldest hiding place imaginable, back at the crime scene itself. That possibility unsettled everyone. It suggested a level of confidence or arrogance, someone who knew the rhythms of the neighborhood, who understood when the park would be empty, who felt certain they wouldn't be seen digging in the middle of town. To investigators, it painted a portrait of a killer who was not only calculating but embedded in the very community that had spent years searching for answers. The idea that the body had been concealed beneath the sand, while families continued to bring their children to play, added a new layer of horror. Detectives pored over old search logs, comparing them to witness accounts, looking for discrepancies. They found that while officers had focused on wooded edges, vehicles, and outlying areas, the sandpit had been disturbed only superficially in those first frantic days. With dozens of volunteers and police crowding the park, it had been overlooked. That oversight created the perfect opening for someone to return later when attention had shifted elsewhere. The maintenance worker remained on their radar, as did a handful of men who had lived near the park at the time and later moved away under quiet circumstances. One had a history of petty crime, another had been accused of inappropriate behavior around children, though never charged. Each was tracked down, interviewed, and pressed about their whereabouts. Each denied involvement. Without forensic evidence directly linking them to the remains, detectives were left circling suspicion without a way to land on proof. For the mother, the reopening of suspects felt like reliving the earliest days of the nightmare. She watched as names resurfaced in the news, some familiar, some long forgotten. Each carried the possibility of being the one, yet each slipped through the cracks once more. She told reporters she no longer trusted the process, that if someone could bury her daughter's body in the very park she sat in for years, then anyone could be responsible. The town, too, felt the weight of those suspicions. People whispered again about neighbors, co-workers, and old acquaintances. The same divisions that had torn through the community in the months after the disappearance flared back to life, only sharper now, because the body's discovery proved the killer had been closer than anyone wanted to believe. The safe assumption that a stranger passing through had taken her no longer held. It pointed inward to someone who had lived among them, unseen, for 8 years. As detectives pressed on, the question that haunted them was not just who had done it, but when. Had the child been killed immediately and buried in a careless rush? Or had the killer walked among search parties waiting for the moment to return, choosing the sandpit as the perfect hiding place in plain sight? The investigation, once cold, was burning again. But the answers remained just out of reach, as though the truth itself was buried as deeply as the body had been. When detectives reopened the case, they began combing through records of missing children in the surrounding counties, looking for anything that might resemble what had happened at the playground. At first, the files seemed unconnected, isolated incidents scattered over the years. But as investigators laid the timelines side by side, a troubling pattern began to take shape. There were other cases, not identical, but similar enough to raise alarm. Children had gone missing, if only for a short time, in towns within a 50-mile radius. Each incident ended with the child being found, wandering alone near a store, hiding in a wooded lot, or appearing hours later shaken but alive. None of them had made major headlines, but when viewed together, the repetition could no longer be ignored. One case involved a boy taken from a schoolyard just 2 towns over. His disappearance sparked a frantic search, only for him to be found later that evening near a gas station. He was unharmed, but too young to explain exactly what had happened. Another involved a girl who vanished from outside her church during a Sunday picnic. Hours later, she was discovered walking along a road miles away. She claimed she'd followed a man who promised to show her a puppy, but her details were hazy, and police chalked it up to confusion. The incidents had been written off as isolated, But in light of the buried body in the sand pit, they took on new significance. Detectives noticed something else. Nearly all of the incidents had occurred in or near playgrounds, parks, or spaces where children gathered. They were places where strangers could blend in without raising suspicion, where parents' attention might wander for only a few moments. It mirrored the circumstances of the case that had haunted their town for 8 years. The swing set, the momentary distraction, the child vanishing in an instant. The possibility that a predator had been operating across towns, refining methods and testing boundaries, became impossible to dismiss. Still, evidence was thin. In most of the earlier incidents, the children had been returned quickly, leaving investigators with little physical proof to examine. The children themselves, young and frightened, had been unreliable witnesses. Some couldn't describe the person they had seen, others contradicted themselves under pressure. With no lasting injuries and no clear suspects, those cases had been filed away as misunderstandings or minor scares. But in the shadow of the girl's death, detectives began to question whether they had all been near misses in a larger pattern. They revisited those families, now years removed from their ordeals. Parents recalled the terror of those hours, the relief of reunion, and the frustration when police told them there wasn't enough evidence to pursue. Many had tried to put it behind them, believing their children had been lucky. But hearing that another child had vanished and been found murdered so close to their own experiences reopened old wounds. Several said they always suspected something more sinister had been at play, but without proof, no one had listened. The disturbing possibility emerged that the same individual had attempted multiple abductions, succeeding only once, the case of the little girl from the swing. If true, it suggested a predator who had operated in the region, testing circumstances, blending into everyday life. It was someone who could appear ordinary enough to approach a child in public, someone unnoticed until it was too late. Detectives found themselves staring at maps covered in pins, wondering how many close calls had gone unseen. The realization shook the community. Parents who had once dismissed those other cases as isolated incidents began to see them differently. Local forums filled with speculation. People revisited old memories, asking if they had ever seen someone suspicious near their own children. Rumors spread that the killer might still be out there, living quietly in one of their neighborhoods, capable of striking again. The playground, already haunted by the child's disappearance and discovery, now symbolized something larger, a predator's chosen hunting ground. But suspicion was not the same as evidence. Detectives had no fingerprints, no DNA, no witnesses who could connect the cases. The circumstantial similarities weren't enough to prosecute anyone. The files from neighboring towns were thin and in some cases destroyed after years of inactivity. Investigators were left with a web of possibilities, but nothing solid to hold on to. The pattern suggested a predator, but in court, suggestion meant nothing without proof. The lack of evidence fueled frustration among the families. Parents who had lived through the temporary disappearances felt dismissed all over again, as though their ordeals were footnotes to a larger tragedy. They demanded answers, but detectives admitted their hands were tied. Without physical links, they couldn't name a suspect or build a case. The suspicion hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and unavoidable, but without the lightning strike of confirmation. For the mother of the murdered girl, the pattern brought no comfort, only deeper despair. It suggested her daughter had not been the victim of random chance, but of someone who practiced, someone who may have tried and failed before succeeding with her. It meant her daughter's death had not been inevitable, but preventable if earlier incidents had been taken more seriously. That realization was another wound layered on top of years of grief. In the end, the disturbing pattern was left as a haunting possibility rather than a solved truth. Investigators admitted privately they believed a predator had been operating in the area, someone who blended seamlessly into the background. But with no solid evidence, they couldn't prove it. The town was left with an even darker suspicion that the killer had not only buried a child in their playground, but had also walked among them for years, attempting and failing, until one day they succeeded. The final report came after months of re-examinations, forensic testing, and interviews that stretched across the community. Detectives had hoped the discovery of the remains would provide a breakthrough, that hidden evidence might point directly to the person responsible. Instead, the conclusion was devastating in its simplicity. The medical examiner determined the girl had been murdered on the very day she vanished. There were no signs she had been kept alive elsewhere, no indication she had survived beyond those first hours. Her body had been wrapped, concealed, and buried in the sandpit near the swings while the world above carried on as if she had simply vanished into thin air. The report confirmed what many feared but could hardly process. For 8 years, families had brought their children to that park. They had celebrated birthdays, shared picnics, and watched their kids laugh on the same swings. All the while, the body of a child had been hidden beneath the sand, her grave disturbed by shovels and footsteps, yet never uncovered. It was not just the act of murder that horrified the town, but the chilling proximity, the way her absence had become part of their lives while her presence had remained unseen, underfoot. Investigators tried to close the gaps in the timeline. They reanalyzed the scene, piecing together how the killer could have hidden a body in such a public place. The conclusion pointed toward audacity. Whoever was responsible had taken a calculated risk, returning or acting quickly enough to bury the child in an area swarming with police, volunteers, and neighbors. It was bold, almost taunting. The fact that it had worked suggested not just luck, but planning, knowledge of how searches unfolded and where their blind spots lay. Attention once again turned to people who had been part of the community for years. A maintenance worker with keys to the grounds, a neighbor with direct view of the park, individuals who had once offered help during the searches. Files marked with their names resurfaced, their alibis revisited, their movements scrutinized. But every lead ended the same way. There was suspicion, but no proof. Without DNA, fingerprints, or a confession, the evidence remained circumstantial. Detectives admitted privately that they believed the killer had been someone trusted, someone woven into the daily fabric of the town. But belief wasn't enough to stand in court. For the mother, the report's findings shattered any illusions of hope she had clung to for 8 years. The idea that her daughter might have been alive somewhere, waiting to be found, was replaced with the knowledge that she had been dead all along, buried just feet away from where she sat praying for her return. It was a cruel twist that deepened her grief rather than easing it. Neighbors remembered seeing her return to the playground one last time, staring at the sandpit as though trying to make sense of the impossible, that she had spent years sitting so close to her child without ever knowing. The community was left divided between relief and horror. Relief that the child had finally been found, that her remains had been identified and returned to her family. Horror that the truth offered no justice, no accountability, and no sense of safety. Parents felt betrayed not just by the killer, but by the investigation itself. For years they had trusted that everything possible had been done. The final report confirmed instead that a child's body had been overlooked in the most obvious of places. That revelation eroded confidence in the systems meant to protect them. In the absence of charges, the case settled into a grim limbo. The file was not closed, but it was clear to everyone that without new evidence, it might never be solved. Detectives admitted to the press that they had exhausted every lead. They asked the public once more for information, urging anyone with knowledge to come forward, but no new witness appeared, no confession surfaced. Silence was the only response. The same silence that had hung over the case since the first day. The playground was eventually rebuilt again, this time stripped of the sandpits altogether. Rubber flooring replaced the old surfaces, and new equipment was installed in an attempt to give the park a fresh start. But the memories clung stubbornly. Parents avoided the area, children whispered about the girl buried beneath their feet, and the swing set stood mostly empty. The space had become less a playground and more a reminder, a physical scar left on the heart of the town. The truth unearthed in the sand was undeniable, but it offered no resolution. A child had been murdered in broad daylight and hidden in plain sight for 8 years. Suspicion pointed to someone among them, perhaps even someone they once trusted. But without answers, suspicion remained only that, a shadow cast over every face, every neighbor, every passing stranger. The killer had blended back into ordinary life, and justice never came. The story ended not with closure, but with a haunting reality. The girl's disappearance had shattered her family, scarred a community, and exposed the limits of even the most determined investigation. The sand pit had revealed the truth, but not the name. And so, the town carried forward, forever haunted by the knowledge that the monster who had buried a child beneath their playground had never been caught, and might still walk quietly among them.